According to many New Testament scholars, whether they're conservative, liberal, whatever, according to Christian scholars, the Gospel of Mark is our earliest gospel. So I want to pay attention to. Now, Christians always say Jesus died on the cross and he was resurrected. Well, the problem is that death by crucifixion typically took days, not hours. Jesus was only on the cross for 6 hours. So, in order for someone to die on the cross, they need to be on the cross for at least a few days. So, that's why I still believe in the swoon theory that Jesus was crucified, but he survived and he was taken down from the cross alive. Uh, so that's what I strongly believe. But notice in the Gospel of Mark chapter 16 ends with verse 8. It says, trembling and bewildered, the women being Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of James. The women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. So the earliest gospel, the Gospel of Mark, does not have the resurrection story. It says the earliest manuscripts and some other ancient witnesses do not have verses 9 to 20. So what that means is that the resurrection story of Jesus in the earliest gospel of Mark was seen as a fabrication or a fabrication that was not in the earliest Greek manuscripts of Mark. So what that means is, the earliest gospel did not have the resurrection story. Now, notice how nobody sees Jesus rise from the dead. No one sees Jesus being resurrected. They only go to the empty tomb and run away. The women go to the empty tomb and run away. So, what that means is that Jesus was taken down alive from the cross, put into the tomb, and from the tomb he was raised to heaven. We find this in a document called the Q Gospel. But anyways, now notice what the Gospel of Mark chapter 16 verse 12 says in these, fabricated verses. Afterward, Jesus appeared in a different form to two of them while they were walking in the country. So it means that Jesus came back as there was some kind of visionary Jesus that they were seeing and not a flesh and blood resurrected Jesus, according to the Gospel of Mark, chapter 16, verse 12, even though these are fabricated verses. So, that's basically, like the earliest gospel does not have the resurrection of Jesus. That means that the resurrection story of Jesus appearing to his disciples and the women after the empty tomb was seen as a fabrication or some kind of fabricated story that came after the first century or after the Gospel of Mark was written in Greek. So that's why I affirmed the belief that when Jesus was put in the tomb, from the tomb he was taken into heaven. Uh, because in none of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, nobody sees Jesus rise from the dead. No one sees Jesus get resurrected. So, going back to the Q Gospel, it means that Jesus predicted his disappearance from earth and not his resurrection. Because, again, keep in mind the Q Gospel, which is earlier than any of the writings of the New Testament, including Paul, does not have Jesus' death and resurrection. It has Jesus' assumption, because Jesus says, "You will not see me again." According to the Q Gospel. So it had Jesus' assumption into heaven as opposed to his resurrection. And again, like I said before, it was Paul who made up the resurrection of Jesus, as we see in, let me pull that up right now. We see in Galatians 1, chapter 11 to 12, where Paul says, I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that the gospel I preach is not of human origin. I did not receive it from any man, nor was I taught it. Rather, I received it by revelation of Jesus Christ. So Paul didn't get the death and resurrection, or the death of Jesus on the cross and the resurrection, from the disciples or the apostles of Jesus. He got it from his own vision or revelation from Jesus Christ. The Greek word for revelation is apocalypse, apocalypse, which means like a vision or something. So that's where Paul was getting his information about the death and resurrection of Jesus, not from the disciples, but from his own. but from his own revelations or from his reading of the Old Testament. Let's go to 1 Corinthians so I can further illustrate this. Because if we read 1 Corinthians chapter 3, or I'm sorry, 1 Corinthians chapter 4, uh, chapter, or 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 4, it says that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, and he was buried, and he was raised on the third day according to the scriptures. So Paul is getting Jesus, death and resurrection, not from the disciples, not from the apostles, or not from the disciples of Jesus who are eyewitness to Jesus' life, etc. But Paul is getting it from his own reading of the Old Testament and his own revelations or his own visions from or his own visions. So Paul is getting his information from the Old Testament and revelations or visions, and not from the disciples. So Paul made up the death and resurrection of Jesus. It seems like, according to the Gospel of Mark, etc., that Jesus survived his crucifixion, and he was put in the tomb, and from the tomb he was taken into heaven. Uh, you know, because if we read the Gospel of Mark carefully, Pilate marveled that Jesus died so soon, because death by crucifixion typically took days and not hours. So this is just my brief thoughts on the crucifixion of Jesus. Keep in mind what the Quran says. They didn't kill him, nor did they crucify him. It just looked like they did, and Allah raised him up to himself. Quran chapter 4, verse 157 to Quran chapter 4, verse 157 to 158. So this explains the Quran chapter 4, verse 157 and 158. If we read the Gospels carefully, we see that Jesus did not die, but he survived. And we see that nobody sees Jesus get resurrected. No one sees Jesus rise from the dead. The earliest Gospel of Mark that did not have the resurrection story. And that, according to the Q Gospel, Jesus was taken up alive into heaven. And Paul was the one who first propagated and made up the story of Jesus being killed and resurrected using his own revelations and his reading of the Old Testament. So Paul made up the death and resurrection of Jesus, not the disciples. So this is just my brief thoughts on the crucifixion, the resurrection in the Quran, chapter 4, verse 157. Keep in mind, the Gospel of Mark did not have the earliest Gospel of Mark did not have the resurrection story of Jesus. So what that means is that the resurrection story was made up later, and it improved and it evolved as the Gospel of Matthew, Luke, and John were written. Stay tuned, more videos coming up debunking the so-called death and resurrection of Jesus.